Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Inside your cells, yes. And we are symbionts with them.
Symbionts?
Life forms living together for mutual advantage. Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force.
Welcome to Star Wars Uplink. While the prequels are getting a second life and a second wind now, they weren't always perceived this way, and a big part of that has come from memes, and I think the biggest memes when you look at the prequels, besides all the Anakin stuff, would be the midichlorians. The midichlorians was an idea George Lucas played around with and took away the mysticism of the Force, and I want to talk about if it is actually dead forever, or if we may see it again. Prequels were a wild time for Star Wars. It seemed like George Lucas was just throwing things at the wall in certain aspects, and then the others, he was just like really strategic in the world that he was building. And I would say George Lucas has always been more of a world builder than he is on telling the specifics of Star Wars and the other projects that he's done, honestly. Because if you look at the other projects he's done, American Graffiti, he captured the vibe of that era very well. THX 1138, he captured the vibe of that very well and built this very interesting world. And then you go to Star Wars, and everything about the world is so fascinating. The characters are a little bit more one-sided, but they're still interesting. And then you get to the dialogue, and it's a little bit worse for wear. And I feel like George Lucas benefits when he goes into the mysticism side of things, goes into more of the Joseph Campbell storytelling art. He's more of a fantasy storyteller than he is a science fiction storyteller. And I don't think that's clearer than the prequels. If you look at the original trilogy, that was very much a fantasy tale in a science fiction world. If you look at the prequels, it was more of a science fiction story in a fantasy world, which I think changed things a little too quickly if we look at the idea of the midichlorians.
The Force? The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together.
The different ideas of the Force in Star Wars are very interesting. On the one hand, you have very Joseph Campbell, very religious, inspired storytelling around the mysticism of the Force, this thing that binds everyone together, and that's it. It's this idea. Some people are more attuned to it and can utilize it as a power, and others just aren't aware of it, even though it is connecting everyone. And then in the prequel side of things, no, it's very scientific. It's very clear and clinical in a way that I think really takes away from this experience of the Force. And if you look at what has been produced after the prequels, there has been no mention of midichlorians anywhere at all. It's not there. Everyone's kind of just sweeping it under the rug. And I think that's good on one hand, but I do wonder if this was like the turning point for Star Wars. Like, was the midichlorians them finding the edge of Star Wars, or was it just kind of like part of the experience? Or I wonder too, if we look at it from a lore perspective, was it originally this idea that was very clinical, this something that you could measure, and then as time progressed and as the Jedi disappeared, it became more mystical? Or was the fallacy of the Jedi Order part of this taking away of the mysticism? Because if you look at the Jedi Order in the prequel era, they are a mess. They are going far too broad. They are going way past what they originally intended to be, which was guardians. They were intended to be protectors of the people and not warriors as part of the Republic. They had become so different from what they were originally supposed to be, and I think this is where things start to get interesting. Because we can talk until we're blue in the face on like, oh my gosh, I can't believe George Lucas did this with Star Wars, midichlorians are the worst, oh my gosh, so cringe. But that's not exciting. I want to look at it from a lore perspective. What does it look like for this to happen in the prequels? This to be the perspective of the Jedi at that time, and then later on, it just not be there. And even if we look at the High Republic, earlier on, it's not there either. So I had this idea of almost giving myself a challenge. What would it look like for lore to explain the absence of the midichlorians? And it got me thinking. I mentioned earlier about this idea that possibly because of the introduction and breadth and expansion of the Jedi that we had in the prequel era, if that maybe had something to do with the Force becoming less mystical, if it had something to do with this idea of almost farming Jedi. As if you look at it, that's what the Jedi Order did. They found Force sensitives all throughout the galaxy. They took them from their families, and some of them were offered up. I think there's some stories and legends where they weren't necessarily offered up, and they trained them in this idea. They found them, took away their connections to their family, and they really just made a factory for Force wielders. And I wonder if that was because of the rise. If this era is that side of things. What if the prequel era, this idea of the Clone Wars and this kind of technology that was around there, what if Star Wars at this point was just clinical? If this was them looking at things that they previously took for granted, or maybe just as given, if they started digging a little bit deeper, and like in the early 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, as technology and medicine evolved, our perspective on medicine evolved. I wonder if this was, oh hey, this is something that we can feel around us. It's definitely connected. It's all throughout everyone. What if there's this thing that binds us together from like an anatomy perspective? If this is what happened, I think it would make sense for them to, as they got more information, slowly step away from that. And maybe because of the fall, and maybe it was because of Palpatine and him hiding some of the things to the broader Star Wars galaxy, eventually people just stepped away from it. People said, hey, yeah, no, we're going back to this mysticism thing. We're going back to this idea of the Force is this life force that is all around us, connects us in a spiritual way almost, and it's something that can be used as a tool, yes, but it's something also integral to us living our lives. I think this could be an interesting way. It also introduces some kind of like conspiracy theory of like, what if Palpatine was working all along to hide this idea of the midichlorians, and he was so successful on it that we never see it again in Star Wars? It's a fun headcanon thing, and I think it's mostly for jokes, but it's there. It's, if you want to look a little bit deeper, maybe there's some lore that supports this. But let me know your thoughts on this theory. Why do you think that we don't see midichlorians anymore? Is it because of the backlash? Is it just because of something in lore? What are your thoughts on the midichlorians? I think they're dumb and really lost the whole plot of Star Wars, personally. That's my perspective on it. But let me know your thoughts on it below the description in the comments. And as always, check out our podcast, and may the Force be with you.